In this episode, we're going to talk about severe weather and how to plan for the average. Yeah, I know. I'll explain when we get into the episode, but stay tuned. You're going to want to hear this, and I also want to hear your thoughts on this topic. We'll get into it in this episode. Before we get into today's topic, I want to remind everybody, if your business is reopening after any kind of closure due to COVID, or you've continued to remain open, but you're struggling with how to mark your facilities to ensure physical distancing and relay important information about safety and health as it relates to COVID, I want you to go visit our friends over at MightyLine Floor Tape. MightyLine has some great products for you to mark your floors, whether it be the stand here, the 6 feet distancing, or just floor tape to denote lanes of travel. They have everything you need to mark your facility. So hit the link in the show notes, visit our friends at MightyLine Floor Tape. They are incredible partners in safety. I can't thank them enough for their support of the podcast. Again, MightyLine Tape for all of your floor marking needs. All right. Yeah, we're going to talk about severe weather, the unfortunate events that occurred in December earlier. December 10th, and across 5 different states. It was a tragic turn of events. You know, Mother Nature is cruel sometimes, and it's terrible. We hate hearing about such loss and devastation. So we're going to kind of get into this topic. I'll be honest, I've been out of the game for about a month. I'm just still trying to get over this, but I've been very active on the SafetyPro Podcast Community because, you know, I don't have to talk a whole lot. I can post and comment over there. I do record a daily coffee topic, about 3 minutes I can get out and talk about various topics throughout, the week, each week. So I've been very active over there, and big shout out to all of you premium members over there at the SafetyPro Podcast Community, keeping me going daily over there. We have a good time. We have great conversations, but I've been out of commission. This illness, it got a hold of me, and it wasn't COVID. I got tested 3 different times for COVID, and they're all negative. So whatever I got, it hung on to me for about a month. And, oh man, it was terrible. I didn't feel deathly ill or anything. It's just, it was an upper respiratory type of thing. So I couldn't talk a lot. I would lose my breath and I would just start coughing, and it was terrible. And so recording audio probably was not, going to happen. And so I took some time to heal up. Like I said, I've still got those residual symptoms going on. I'm going to do a follow-up and hopefully have an update for you. But yeah, COVID was the first thing that came to mind, to be honest with you. And the doctors were like, no, you don't have it. So just keep that in mind. There's other stuff out there still going around, and and it wasn't flu either. So I don't know what it was, but it kind of kicked my butt. But hey, I'm back on the mend. I'm back on the horse. I'm here talking to you. And how have you been? I hope you've been doing good, and all is well with you. Would love to hear from you. Drop me a line. And, if you haven't, not to plug it too much, head over to the community site, because we have a lot of great conversations going over there. And, conversations not just about, COVID and the workplace and the OSHA ETS updates and all that good stuff, but we do a lot of just non-work related conversations and, sharing what we're into, what our interests and likes are. So check it out over there. You can also direct message me that way on the community site as well. But look, this topic, I posted this over there. I wrote a lengthy blog post over there because I wasn't in a spot to be able to record this at that time, even back a couple weeks ago. So it was tough for me. But, I'm going to just kind of go through this blog post. I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to share a link to a resource that is promising, that is, I think, something that we should probably get behind. It's reasonable, and we'll get into it. When natural disasters occur, it's understandable to ask why, especially when they result in just such loss of life and property, right? We tend to just want answers, and we might even need to point a finger of blame at somebody, right? Anybody. Just helps us rationalize those events. But seeing the scale of the destruction resulting not from process failures, machinery or equipment or human error, but from Mother Nature, it challenges our conventional wisdom regarding how we analyze incidents and we digest and do our deep dive. So in this case, of course, I'm referring to December 10th and the tornadoes that went through the Midwest. Now, while we should ask questions, the lens through which we view these events needs to change once we realize that, we're dealing with an event that is well beyond human control. So that's key. That's the theme. Focus on what you can control. And that's going to be the message here. We've all heard severe weather warnings, right? I mean, I hear them all the time. Just last week, it was like 2-3 days in a row. High wind advisory. And you become numb almost to a point that you think, well, that's for the general area. That's up a little bit north from me, or they said that it's not going to come down this way. We go through life with all these warnings, all this, dare I say, doom and gloom between COVID and severe weather. We're just constantly bombarded by these dire warnings of doom. And I mean, how do we not get a little desensitized, a little numb to that? And I think that's sort of the pendulum swinging the other way. That's the other side of this coin of like, if everything's a tragedy, then nothing is tragic, right? I mean, I think it's reasonable for us in society, right? You hear these weather warnings, and we know that technically all thunderstorms can produce tornadoes. But when we take this knowledge and we combine it with our culturally acceptable risk tolerance, right, when it comes to weather, and we can see that it's no reasonable person could have known these events would have occurred on the scale that they occurred, nor would they have placed themselves or others in a hazardous situation. So we almost have to remove that from the equation. We need to stop asking questions around, why didn't somebody get leave? Why didn't somebody do this? And I mean, if you look at the photos in the video, and I have no personal knowledge of any of the events that took place other than seeing what you all saw through the media, right? But if you look at those photos and those videos of news footage, right? I mean, you saw the paths that ripped through. I mean, at some point, unless you're in an underground bunker in the base of a mountain, like NORAD or something like that, I mean, that would survive a nuclear blast, I mean, you're really, I mean, there's only so much you can do. And that's what I want to focus on. I want to focus on what we can do that is practicable and reasonable, okay? Now, does this mean we don't pay attention to severe weather emergencies or alerts? No, of course not. It does mean that a reasonable person would accept this common risk of being inside a sound structure with, or even in a known area to shelter if the need arises. Beyond that, you're not going to do much, right? I mean, can we plan for the absolute worst case scenario? Is that even realistic? I mean, I don't know that we can. So what we end up usually doing is we end up landing somewhere on the spectrum of planning for the average event in our society. And to be clear, I'm not talking about workplace safety. I'm talking about in society when it comes to Mother Nature, what we generally find acceptable, okay? I'll give you an example. Let's take the 100-year flood. The 100-year flood, basically, there's a 1% chance of this being equaled or exceeded during any given year. And that's what the 100-year flood means. As the time indicates, the 100-year flood is not a frequent event. Okay, it's relatively rare. So, as a result, most communities, they use a design frequency of like 5 to 20 years for their stormwater systems. And why this is important is because if you have an event, those stormwater systems, that's what's going to keep property from being destroyed and potentially loss of life due to flooding, okay? This level of protection takes care of most surface water problems over this period of time and provides reasonable balance between safety, cost, and just practicality, okay? That's generally accepted in society. So here's the other thing. The vast majority of floods that occur in the U.S. are not 100-year floods, regardless of what doom and gloom media covers. The vast majority of floods that occur in the U.S. are not 100-year floods. So they use this term 100-year flood inaccurately to describe much lesser floods. It creates a misconception that 100-year floods occur every few years, which we know is false, and can cause the public to question our preparation for such events and actually have a negative effect on, like, well, what are you going to do? There's nothing you can do, right? So that's the question. What can we do? Okay, do we not ask questions? Do we not ask what we can do? No, of course not. We do need to ask the questions differently, though. As for the recent tornadoes, it is reasonable to presume that the buildings in the affected areas of destruction, whether they were homes or businesses, they were designed and built and maintained up to code, up to standards. So, we could throw that off the table. We could take that off the table, right? But here's the issue. Building designs have historically not accounted for tornadoes. According to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, the strength of tornadoes and a common perception that the risk of being struck by one is low, that's fed into this misconception that addressing tornadoes in building design would be far too costly. But here's the question. Can we use the same middle ground that we do for the 100-year flood when it comes to tornadoes? So I'll give you an example. In 2011, there was a record-breaking tornado season. I mean, it wreaked havoc across the U.S., and NIST thoroughly investigated one of the worst events that year. There was a tornado. It was rated as the most severe on the EF scale, okay? It was an EF5. It ripped through Joplin, Missouri, and many of you may remember this. Among the more than 8,000 buildings damaged in the tornado's wake were schools, big box stores, nursing homes, fire stations, even a major hospital that was completely torn down and was never rebuilt. The NIST team found that although the most powerful winds laid waste, absolute waste, to buildings near the center of the tornado. So you're not going to design for that, okay? That's the point. But more than 70% of the total damage path stemmed from lower wind speeds further out. So 70% of the total damage in the entire area, 70%, were from lower wind speeds further out from the center of the tornado. And designing for that level of wind is more economically viable. Okay, but look, understand this. It will not eliminate the potential of the loss of life and property. Okay, and that is the bargain we make as society. Building codes and standards don't require design for the worst possible floods, hurricanes, or earthquakes. So we could take the same approach for tornadoes, right? And NIST has a draft building standards proposal to address that very issue. The draft of the new building standards features a first-of-a-kind tornado hazard map meant to guide the design of facilities like schools, fire stations, hospitals, buildings, based on their size and geographic location. So for the first time, tornado-prone regions have guidance to better design new buildings to withstand these events. And of course, the hope is that the standard is adopted by the model building codes maintained by the independent codes and standards organizations and incorporated into U.S. state and local building codes, right, which will save more lives. We have to come to a collective agreement between individuals, business leaders, local, state, and federal regulatory agencies regarding looking for fault, right? Considering the overwhelming evidence that anyone could have done little to nothing to anticipate this disaster. Asking why we did not place our shelter-in-place area 5 feet to the east is not particularly beneficial, especially since these are naturally occurring events and they're all different. Asking whether there was a working alert system may not be all that beneficial, considering the varying regulatory requirements from state to state, even county to county within some states, regarding alarm systems for severe weather. I mentioned earlier about the lens through which we got to view these things, right? I'm referring to a forward-looking lens, like a telescope, rather than, a rear view mirror, okay, which is very narrow. It's very small and very narrow. A rear view mirror viewpoint or outlook will only ask why we did not have something in place that was not previously required. Okay, so hindsight bias is what we're talking about here, and it's not particularly helpful in this case. Forward-looking lens, though, can ask the same question but in a different context. Should buildings contain different design criteria for materials and construction in certain regions of the country? Should we require structural requirements for shelter-in-place areas inside large open-span structures like warehouses or manufacturing facilities? And should we integrate the National Weather Service alert system into existing automated building notification systems, which usually only refer to or deal with evacuations and fires, right? Those are forward-looking improvements that should be discussed based on what we learned. Proposed building standards like the one the NIST had drafted, they aim to answer these appropriate questions. In the meantime, we need to take all reasonable and prudent actions to protect your loved ones, your workers, improve your homes and businesses against severe weather events. And if you can, please find ways to assist those affected communities. There are a bunch of charities out there working hard to restore these people, these families, to a life that resembles, and as best they can, the life that they had prior to these events. Look, I wrote this blog for the SafetyPro Podcast Community at a time where I was struggling to even be able to speak. And, I wrote it out and posted it there. I wanted to share it with the broader podcast audience because it's important. And I kind of, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, by saying, planning for the average. But when we look at public health, public safety, not workplace safety, it's a completely different lane, right? But when we're talking about these things, we don't plan, nor can we realistically plan for the absolute worst case scenario all of the time when it comes to the general public out in society. But when it comes to tornadoes, we now have an option like we do for hurricanes, floods, and earthquakes in those areas to be able to plan reasonably and practicably for such events, certain events. And so I encourage you, hit the link in the show notes to the NIST article. I think it's really, really compelling. I hope that a lot of these things do get adopted into building codes and standards. I think we can make a lot of improvements in just infrastructure and how we construct our buildings, which essentially are homes and businesses, where we spend all of our time, okay, to make them safer. So let me know what you think. Head on over to the SafetyPro Podcast Community, join in on the conversation, and I'll talk to you on the next SafetyPro Podcast.